Talking about how to combat overwhelm in the grant planning process. So, if you are feeling overwhelmed with your grant writing, stick around because I'm going to give you 3 ways that you can combat that overwhelm. If you're new around here, I'm Sarah Dobson. I am a research grant consultant and I help early career researchers get funded at NIH. So, let's talk about overwhelm. First of all, let's talk about why you are overwhelmed. And I suspect if you are like most early career researchers that I speak to, it's because you've got way too much going on. You've got way too much on your plate, way too many projects and responsibilities, and not necessarily a great system to manage all of that. But what normally happens is that we look right away to systems to manage all of the projects that we have on our plate. And I am guilty of this as well. I will say that one of my first instincts when I'm feeling overwhelmed is to find a better project management system to manage all the things. But honestly, to me, that is the very first sign that I actually need to take things off my plate. If what I am doing has sort of expanded beyond what my project management system allows me to manage, it means that I'm doing something wrong, not that I need a better project management system. So let's talk about that first before we get into those 3 tips around how to actually combat overwhelm. It's how much stuff you actually have on your plate and what you are going to do to remove some of that from your plate, because ultimately overwhelm is just dealing with too many things all at once. And it is a symptom of a sort of mismanagement of priorities, right? So let's talk about that first. So, the number one thing that you need to do to combat overwhelm is to take another look at your goals and priorities, right? What do you really want to be accomplishing in your research career? What kind of impact do you want to make with your research? Look there first and get really clear on what that is to you. And then take a look at everything you have on your plate and assess how much of what you are doing is actually helping you move that forward to help you reach that goal and that impact that you want to have with your research, versus how much of it is just other stuff that you've somehow been roped into or that you've said yes to because you were flattered to be asked. There are lots of different reasons that we take on projects and do things that are not necessarily aligned with where we want to go with our research. And so, again, that very first step is taking a look at that, getting really clear on what we are working on, all of the various things that we're working on, and how much of that is actually lined up with where we actually want to go and what we want to be doing with our research career. And then, step 1B is to start finding ways to get stuff off your plate and to be more focused on what your priorities and goals actually are. Okay. So that's number one. Number two is to get really specific about what the next step grant is and how you can break that down into smaller pieces. One of the other big reasons that we get overwhelmed is we look at projects as a whole. And when we look at them as a whole, they seem really daunting and impossible. But if we're able to break them down into smaller chunks, that makes life so much easier. So when you think about your upcoming NIH application, and if you're thinking about it as a whole, for example, I have to write an R01, that is a lot. It seems a lot more insurmountable than breaking it down into smaller components and saying, okay, well, first I have to work on this piece, and then I have to work on this next piece, and then I have to work on this next piece, right? So when you're combating overwhelm in that way, you are taking a large project and you're breaking it down into smaller pieces. And that can really help with motivation and momentum. And the third way to combat overwhelm is to make sure that you are clear on your deadlines and your milestones. All right. And I know a lot of us think about just the deadline, and it seems like it's a long way off. And so we kind of ignore it, or, we work on the grant when we feel like it, because it seems like it's a long way off. The deadline is a long way off. But one of the ways that you can combat the overwhelm that happens when you realize that the deadline is actually really close and you need to drop everything and get it out the door, one of the ways to avoid that is to make sure that you are setting up milestones along the way to that final submission deadline, so that you know whether you're on track or off track, right? Which again requires you to go back to that second step that we talked about, which is to break your project down into smaller chunks and assign milestones to the different components there. So you know what your final deadline is, but you also know, in order to have an entire grant completed by the time you get to that final deadline, you're going to need to have other pieces completed before that, right? So if you can set up those milestones in advance that are going to allow you to hit that final deadline, that will prevent you from getting to a point where you realize, all of a sudden that the deadline is a few weeks away and you really have to drop everything else and get this grant out the door. So what you're really doing there is combating overwhelm by giving yourself more time and having a system in place that will allow you to identify whether you're on track or off track. Okay. So we're going to summarize those 3 key components of combating overwhelm when it comes to writing NIH grants. Number 1 is to get really clear on your goals and priorities and make sure that you're not overwhelmed because you're doing too much stuff that is not tied to the impact that you want to have with your research, right? So that's number 1, is identifying those goals and priorities and then doing what you can to remove the things on your plate that aren't serving your ultimate mission as a scientist. Number 2 is to break down the grant writing project into smaller chunks. And this is really about establishing a project management system, right? It's about finding a system that will allow you to tackle this massive project and break it down into smaller pieces so that it doesn't seem so overwhelming. And number 3 is to make sure that you have milestones in place that will allow you to identify when you are off track or on track. And sort of alongside that, making sure that you have given yourself enough time and a long enough runway to actually write the grant, so that you're not trying to squeeze it all into a few weeks right before the deadline. So if you found that helpful, I invite you to sign up for our free resource library, where we have lots of other tools and resources for you to write better NIH grants. You can find the link to sign up to the resource library in the video description below this video. See you next time.